He took off his wedding ring, set it on the edge of her hospital bed, and walked out while she was still bleeding. Not when the doctor said she might survive. Not after the baby was safe. He left while the monitors were screaming, while the nurses were running, while Lucia Viscari, his wife of 6 years, 31 weeks pregnant with his child, was losing blood faster than they could replace it. He left because his mistress called. And when Lucia reached for her phone with shaking hands and dialed his number 3 times, he didn't answer. On the third call, she heard a woman laughing in the background before the line went dead. That was the moment everything changed. Not just for Lucia. For everyone who thought a man like Dante Moretti was untouchable. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel invisible exactly when you needed them most, stay with me, because this story is for you. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week, I bring you stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and what people are truly capable of. Drop a comment right now telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this one moves you, hit that like button. It lets me know you're here. Now, let's go back to the night Dante Moretti made the worst decision of his life. The emergency room at St. Catherine's Medical Center had seen everything: gunshot wounds, industrial accidents, the aftermath of 3-car pileups on the interstate at 2 in the morning. The nurses who worked the overnight shift had long since stopped flinching at things that would make ordinary people collapse. But when the black SUV pulled up to the ambulance bay just after 11 p.m. on a Thursday in November, even the charge nurse, a woman named Patrice who had worked trauma for 19 years, felt something shift in the air. It wasn't the car. It wasn't the 2 large men in dark coats who stepped out first, scanning the entrance before anyone else moved. It was the woman they carried between them, her white dress soaked through at the waist, her head falling to the side like she'd already stopped fighting. Lucia Viscari Moretti was 29 years old, 31 weeks pregnant, and she was hemorrhaging in a way that told the attending physician, Dr. Emmanuel Okafor, that they had maybe minutes before the situation became something no one in that room could fix. "Get me 2 large-bore IVs, cross-match for 6 units, and someone call OB right now," he said, not loudly, not with panic, the way a man speaks when he has no time left for either. "Who came in with her?" The taller of the 2 men in dark coats stepped forward. He said his name was Marco. He said he worked for Mr. Moretti. He said Mr. Moretti had been contacted and was on his way. Dr. Okafor didn't look up from Lucia's abdomen. "How long has she been bleeding like this?" Marco hesitated. "She called us. We found her on the kitchen floor. Maybe 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Okafor felt the number land somewhere in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. 40 minutes of a placental abruption untreated, in a woman 31 weeks along. "Someone needs to be here," he said. "A family member, her husband." "He's coming," Marco said again. But the way he said it, flat, certain in the wrong way, like a man repeating something he'd been told to say, made Patrice glance up from the IV line she was placing and look at the door. Nobody was coming through it. Lucia was conscious. That was the thing that stayed with Dr. Okafor long after that night, the thing he mentioned to his wife over breakfast the next morning, and couldn't quite stop turning over in his mind. She was conscious through most of it, and she wasn't screaming. She was watching the ceiling with a particular kind of stillness that he'd seen before, but not often. The stillness of someone who has decided to survive something and is using every resource they have to do exactly that. She asked about the baby first, not about herself. The first words out of her mouth, even before they'd gotten the second IV line in, were, "Is she okay? Can you tell if she's okay?" "We're going to take care of both of you," Okafor said. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the answer she was asking for either, and she knew it. "Tell me the truth," Lucia said. Her voice was steady in a way that didn't match the amount of blood she'd lost. "I can handle the truth." He looked at her for a moment. In 19 years of practice, he'd developed a sense for which patients meant that and which ones didn't. She meant it. "She's still showing a heartbeat," he said. "It's where we want it right now. But we need to stabilize you before we can make any promises about anything." Lucia nodded once, like she was filing the information away, and then she closed her eyes and went somewhere else inside herself. Not unconscious, just elsewhere. Somewhere she could hold on. Her phone was in the pocket of the white dress. One of the nurses had set it on the small tray beside her bed, and somewhere around 11:40, when the first round of treatment was underway and the immediate crisis had been pushed back, not resolved, pushed back. Lucia reached for it. She dialed Dante. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She stared at the ceiling, counted to 10, dialed again. This time it rang twice. She heard the call connect. She heard, for a fraction of a second, the sound of a room, a hotel room, she would think later, the particular acoustic quality of a space with carpeted floors and heavy curtains. And she said his name. Dante. The line went dead. She looked at the phone for a moment, then she dialed a 3rd time. This time it connected immediately, and before she could speak, she heard a woman's laugh. High and bright and entirely unconcerned with anything happening in any hospital anywhere in the world. The laugh of someone who has just won something, then nothing. The line went dead again. Patrice, who was charting at the station 6 feet away and pretending not to watch, saw Lucia set the phone down on the tray with a care that seemed almost deliberate, gently, precisely, like she was setting down something fragile and wanted to make sure it didn't break. She didn't throw it, she didn't cry, she just set it down and looked at the wall across from her bed. And then, after a long moment, she stopped looking at it. Patrice had seen a lot of things in 19 years, but she had never seen a woman's face do what Lucia's face did in that moment. A particular kind of closing, like a door being shut very quietly from the inside. Not anger, not grief. Something that came after both of those things and lived in a different country entirely. Dante Moretti was not a man who made mistakes. That was the story he told himself. And it was the story everyone around him had agreed to tell as well, because the alternative, pointing out his mistakes, had consequences that most people preferred to avoid. He had built his organization over 12 years from a mid-level operation into something that controlled significant portions of 3 industries in 2 states. He had done this through a combination of strategic intelligence and a willingness to do things that other men drew back from, and he had arrived at 41 years old with the particular confidence of someone who had never been truly accountable for anything. I was handsome in the way that men who know they are handsome often are. Not effortlessly, but with a kind of practiced awareness, a positioning of the jaw, a way of entering rooms. Women had always responded to him. He had come to expect this the way he expected other things, as a feature of the environment, like gravity. Lucia had been different. That was what he told himself when he married her, and in his better moments, in the early years, it had actually been true. She was the daughter of Aldo Viscari, a man whose legitimate business empire had made the Moretti organization look like a corner store, and she had grown up with a clear-eyed understanding of what power actually looked like up close, which meant she was not impressed by the performance of it. She had looked at Dante not with the awe he was accustomed to, but with a kind of careful attention, like someone reading a document and making notes. He had found this electrifying. He had found it electrifying for approximately 4 years. After that, he had found it inconvenient. Viviana Rossi was the opposite of inconvenient. She was 26, and she laughed at everything he said, and she never looked at him like she was reading a document. She looked at him like he was the answer to a question she'd been asking her whole life. He understood, on some level that he rarely examined closely, that this was a performance. But it was a performance that served him, and so he had chosen not to examine it closely. He had been with Viviana in a suite at the Castleton Hotel when Marco called him. His wife had been found on the kitchen floor. She was being transported to St. Catherine's. She was 31 weeks pregnant and losing blood. He had stood by the window of the hotel suite with his phone in his hand and looked at the city below and felt, for a moment, the particular vertigo of a man who has been living in 2 separate realities and has just been reminded, abruptly, that they occupy the same physical space. Then Viviana had appeared beside him. She was wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of champagne, and she had read his face with the accuracy of someone who had been studying it for 2 years, and she had said, "You're going to leave, aren't you?" It wasn't a question, it had the cadence of a grievance. "Lucia is in the hospital," he said. "She's hemorrhaging. The baby—" "She's always going to be something," Viviana said. "There's always going to be a reason." He looked at her. She had set down the champagne glass, and her expression had changed into something he hadn't seen before, something that sat uneasily on features designed for an entirely different range of emotions. Her eyes were bright, but not with the warmth he was used to. "If you walk out that door," she said, "I swear to you, Dante, I will not be here when you come back. I mean it this time. Viviana, I mean it." Her voice broke on the last word, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, and her eyes filled, and he watched the tears build and he felt the familiar pull of them. The tug that he had never entirely been able to resist, the particular helplessness of watching a woman cry and knowing you are the reason. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep being second. I can't keep watching you go back to her. If you leave right now, I will—" She stopped. "I'll hurt myself," she said quietly. I mean it, Dante. I can't live like this. The room was very quiet. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the glass of champagne she'd set down on the nightstand, still half full. He looked at her hand still pressed against her mouth. And then he did the thing he would spend the rest of his life trying to explain to himself, in the dark, in the small hours of the morning, in the years that followed. He stayed. He told himself he'd go to the hospital once Viviana calmed down. He told himself Marco was there, and the doctors were there, and Lucia was strong. She was always strong. She was the strongest person he knew. She'd be fine. He told himself 30 minutes, just give it 30 minutes. He turned his phone to silent when Lucia called the second time. The third time, Viviana reached over and picked the phone up from the nightstand before he could. And she answered it, and she laughed. That high, bright laugh, the one Lucia heard before the line went dead. And she handed it back to him with an expression that was almost satisfied. He looked at the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he set it face down on the nightstand and went to sit beside Viviana on the edge of the bed. He told himself he would explain everything to Lucia later. He told himself she would understand. He told himself, and this was the part that would come back to him later with the precise cruelty of something designed specifically to cause maximum damage, that Lucia always understood. She always found a way to make sense of things. She would find a way to make sense of this too. What he did not know, in that hotel room, in that hour, was what was happening on the other side of the city. He did not know that after Lucia set her phone down on the tray and stopped looking at the wall, she asked Patrice for a pen. He did not know that she lay in that hospital bed, still on 2 IV lines, still being monitored every 15 minutes, her daughter's heartbeat still fragile and uncertain on the fetal monitor. And she wrote a phone number on the back of a hospital intake form from memory, a number she had not dialed in 4 years, a number that belonged to a man named Gerald Whitmore, who was the senior attorney for Aldo Viscari's private holdings. He did not know that she stared at that phone number for 11 minutes before she picked up her phone again, dialed it, and waited. He did not know that Gerald Whitmore answered on the second ring, even at that hour, because Aldo Viscari's instructions regarding his daughter had been standing for 4 years and had never been rescinded. If she ever called, you answer, no matter when, no matter what. He did not know what Lucia said to Gerald Whitmore in that conversation, which lasted 6 minutes and 14 seconds. He did not know what Whitmore said back. He did not know that by midnight, a series of quiet phone calls had been made to people who did not announce themselves. He did not know that a private medical transport had been arranged, or that a suite had been prepared at the Harrington Institute for Maternal Medicine, a facility so discreet and so well-resourced that most people in the city did not know it existed. He did not know that a specialist in high-risk obstetric hemorrhage was already en route. He did not know any of this because he had turned his phone to silent. He would not know any of it until morning, when he finally walked back into St. Catherine's and found an empty bed, a stripped mattress, and a small tray on the bedside table holding 2 things, his wedding ring, and a document with his name on it, bearing the letterhead of Whitmore, Cass, and Olensky, attorneys at law. He stood at the edge of that empty bed for a long time. The morning shift nurse, a young woman named Dessa, who had only been working the floor for 8 months and did not yet have Patrice's talent for invisibility, made the mistake of looking at him too directly. He turned and asked her where his wife was. She said she wasn't able to share that information. He asked again, with a different quality in his voice, the kind of quality that usually produced results. She said she wasn't able to share that information, sir. She said it without flinching. Later, she would tell Patrice about it, and Patrice would nod and say, Lucia Viscari revoked his access before she left. She would say it in the same tone she used for clinical facts, because by then, that was what it was. A clinical fact entered into a chart, binding and documented and real. But in that moment, standing at the empty bed with his wedding ring in his hand, Dante Moretti did not yet understand what had happened. He understood that Lucia was gone, understood that she had taken their daughter, still unborn, still fighting, still 31 weeks along in a body that had nearly given out, somewhere he did not have access to. He understood that the document on the tray was a legal filing, and that his name appeared in it not as a husband but as a respondent. What he did not understand yet, what he would spend months beginning to understand, in the slow and grinding way that certain truths make themselves known, was that Lucia had not disappeared. She had simply decided. In that emergency room, in the hour after the third call went dead, Lucia Viscari had looked at the wall beside her hospital bed and done something she had never done in 6 years of marriage. She had looked at the life she was living and asked herself, with the flat precision of someone calculating a bridge load, whether it could hold, and she had concluded, quietly and without drama, that it could not. She had not left in anger. She had not left in grief. She had left with the methodical care of a woman who has decided that her survival and her daughter's survival require the complete removal of a particular variable. She had made 3 calls and received none in return. That was enough data. Dante stood at the empty bed with the ring in his hand and felt, for the first time in as long as he could remember, that he did not know what came next. He had been wrong before. He had made miscalculations. But they had always been the kind of mistakes that could be managed, corrected, absorbed into the ongoing narrative of a man who controlled things. This was different. This was an empty room where his wife and his unborn daughter had been, and his wife had left on her own terms, and he did not know where they were. He closed his hand around the ring. He stood there a while longer. Outside, the morning had started. The city was doing what cities do, enormous and indifferent, carrying on. Down the hall, Patrice was finishing her shift, washing her hands at the nurse's station sink, already thinking about the drive home. Through the window at the end of the corridor, the November sky was the particular gray of something not yet decided. Dante Moretti, who had built an empire on the premise that he was a man who did not lose things, looked at the empty bed where his wife had been and understood, in the wordless way that the most important things are always understood, that something had already ended. He just didn't know yet how much. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. The document was 3 pages long. Dante stood at the nurse's station with it in his hand. He had moved there from the empty room because standing at the empty room was something he could only do for so long before the nurses started looking at him the way people look at accidents, and he read it twice. The words were the kind of words that attorneys use when they want to be precise without being loud, the language of people who have thought carefully about what they are doing and have decided to do it anyway. Petition for dissolution of marriage, revocation of medical proxy, restoration of birth name. He read the name at the bottom. Gerald Whitmore. He knew the name. Everyone in a certain tier of this city knew the name. Whitmore was the man who handled Aldo Viscari's private affairs, which meant Whitmore was the man who knew where every dollar Aldo Viscari had ever moved had gone, and what it had purchased, and what it was worth now. The fact that Whitmore's name was on this document meant that Lucia had not acted in a panic. Panic was reaching for your phone. Panic was calling a friend, a sister, someone nearby. Calling Gerald Whitmore at that hour from a hospital bed while hemorrhaging. That was not panic. That was something Dante did not have a word for yet, and the not having a word made something cold settle in the base of his throat. He folded the document, put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, looked at Dessa, who was pretending to chart, and said, "Who authorized the transfer?" She didn't look up. "I'm not able to share that information, sir. I'm her husband." "I understand that, sir." He waited. She kept charting. I understood then that she was not going to give him anything, not because she was afraid of him, and this was the part that registered strangely, the part that didn't fit the usual shape of things, but because she wasn't. She had been told something, and she was going to hold it, and his presence in the hallway was not going to change that. He walked out of St. Catherine's into a gray November morning and sat in the back of his car for 4 minutes without saying a word. Marco, up front, did not turn around. After 4 minutes, Dante said, "Get me Whitmore's office address." Marco said, "It's 6:15 in the morning." Dante said, "I know what time it is." He did not go to Whitmore's office. He went home first, because somewhere between the hospital and the car, he realized that showing up at an attorney's office at 6 in the morning with no sleep and dried tension in his jaw was not the move. Not for a man in his position, not with a legal filing already in his jacket pocket. He needed to think before he moved. That was how he'd built everything he had. Think first. Move second. Never let them see you running. He walked into his house, the house he and Lucia had lived in for 4 years, the one with the high ceilings, and the kitchen she'd had renovated twice because the light wasn't right the first time. And the silence of it hit him in a way he hadn't expected. She hadn't been gone 12 hours. The house didn't look different. Her coat was still on the hook by the door. There was a cup in the drying rack beside the sink, rinsed and turned upside down, which meant she'd had tea sometime yesterday afternoon and cleaned up after herself the way she always did. The small, ordinary evidence of a person who had expected to come back. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the cup for a while. His phone had been on silent since the hotel. He turned the volume back on. 17 missed calls, 2 from Marco, 1 from his mother, 3 from the front desk at his main office building, and 11 from a number he didn't recognize. He listened to the first voicemail from the unknown number. "Mr. Moretti, this is Detective Alan Sutter with the Financial Crimes Unit. We've been attempting to reach you regarding a matter we'd like to discuss at your earliest convenience. Please call us back at... He deleted it. Listen to the next one. Same voice, same unit. This one had been left at 2:14 in the morning. He set the phone on the table and looked at it. Financial crimes. At 2 in the morning. The night his wife ended up in the emergency room. He picked up the phone and called his lawyer. His lawyer's name was Fenwick Krall, and Fenwick had represented the Moretti organization for 9 years, which meant he had long since stopped being surprised by early morning phone calls. He answered on the third ring with the particular alertness of someone who had learned to sleep lightly. "I need you to find out what the Financial Crimes Unit is looking at," Dante said. No preamble. No good morning. Fenwick was quiet for a moment. "Good morning to you too. How's Lucia?" "I need that information today." Another pause, longer. "Dante, how is Lucia?" "She's been transferred, I don't know where." The silence on the other end of the line was the kind that had texture to it. Fenwick was a man who chose his words carefully, which meant his silences were also chosen. This one said something that he was apparently deciding not to say out loud. "I'll make some calls," he said finally. "Give me a few hours." "I said today. I didn't say a few hours." "Dante." Fenwick's voice shifted slightly. Not hard, not soft. The tone of a man who is about to say something he knows won't land well and is saying it anyway. "There are things you need to understand about how this morning is going to go. The financial crimes inquiry, if it's what I think it might be, is not something you want to respond to quickly. Fast is how people make mistakes, and you cannot afford mistakes right now. You have a legal filing in your pocket from Whitmore's office, you have detectives leaving messages at 2 a.m., and your wife is in a hospital somewhere without you. You need to be very deliberate." "I'm always deliberate." "You were at the Castleton last night." Dante said nothing. "I'm not asking," Fenwick said. "I already know. And if I know, other people know. That's the situation you're in. So let me make my calls, quietly. And you sit down and eat something and do not contact Whitmore's office until I tell you to." The line was quiet for a moment. "Fine," Dante said. He hung up and looked at Lucia's cup in the drying rack and did not eat anything. His mother arrived at 9. Claudia Moretti was 63 years old and had the bearing of a woman who had decided early in life that she was not going to apologize for taking up space. She had outlasted 2 of her husband's business partners, 1 federal audit, and a period in her late 40s that she never discussed, and she had come out of all of it with a particular kind of armored calm. She walked into her son's kitchen, set her bag on the counter, and looked at him sitting at the table with yesterday's clothes and a cold expression. "I heard," she said. "How did you hear?" "Marco." She filled the kettle without asking. "How bad?" "She's stable. The baby is still..." He stopped. "I don't know. I don't have access." "You don't have access." His mother repeated the words in a tone that was not quite flat and not quite sharp. Something in between. "To your own wife." "She revoked it." Claudia turned from the kettle and looked at him. She had a way of looking at him that he'd spent his whole life trying to decode. The particular maternal combination of knowing everything and saying only a fraction of it. "She revoked it from a hospital bed." "Yes." "While you were with Viviana." He didn't answer. "Dante." She said his name the way she had said it when he was 15 and had done something that had consequences. The tone that meant she had already calculated the damage and was deciding how much of it to give him at once. "Look at me." He looked at her. "That woman is going to be the end of something," she said. "I've been watching her for 2 years, and she has been building towards something, and I have been trying to tell you, don't start." "I'm not starting. I finished starting 6 months ago. This is me telling you what I see, which is my job as your mother and the only person in your organization who will tell you the actual truth." She set 2 cups on the table, sat down across from him. "Viviana called you away from your bleeding pregnant wife. She did that. She said she was going to hurt herself." The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence. The kind that comes after a statement that is too large for the room. His mother looked at him for a long moment without blinking. Then she said very carefully, "And you believe that?" She was crying. Dante. His mother leaned forward slightly. "When did Viviana Rossi ever do anything that was not calibrated for effect?" He opened his mouth. "Think before you answer," she said. He closed his mouth. She let him sit with it for a moment, the way she had always let him sit with things, because she understood that the spaces between words were where people either learned something or decided not to. Then she said, "I want you to call her right now, while I'm sitting here. And I want you to ask her, plainly, no warning, just ask, where she was at 11 p.m. last night, before you went back to the room. What are you talking about? Ask her, his mother said. You'll understand when she answers. He called Viviana from the kitchen table, with his mother watching from across the rim of her cup. Viviana answered on the first ring, which told him she'd been waiting for it. Her voice was the voice she used when she was managing a situation, warm, slightly concerned, layered with the particular kind of softness that she deployed when she needed him on her side. Dante, I've been so worried. How is she? Is everything... Where were you at 11 last night, he said, before I came back to the room. A pause. Barely a second. But he caught it, because he was looking for it now. What do you mean? I was there. I was upset. You know how I was. Dante, what is this? You were in the room the whole time. Of course I was. A slight edge entering. Why are you asking me this? Because I want to know. Dante, this is strange. I was there. I was crying. Her voice broke in the particular way it broke. The precise place. The familiar fracture line. I was terrified you were going to leave. That's all this was. He looked at his mother. His mother's face said nothing. Viviana, he said, did you call Marco last night? The pause this time was longer, half a second too long. Why would I call Marco? That's not an answer. Dante, I don't understand what... Did you call Marco last night? Another pause, the warm tone shifting into something different underneath it, something like calculation showing through. I may have tried to reach someone. I wasn't feeling well, and you called Marco, he said, to find out when Lucia went to the hospital. The line went quiet. Because you didn't know yet, he said. The pieces arriving in the wrong order, the way they always did. Not all at once, but one by one, each one slightly worse than the last. You called Marco, and Marco told you what was happening, and then you called me crying, Dante, after you already knew she was in the emergency room. That's not... Was any of it real? He didn't raise his voice. That was the thing his mother would tell Fenwick about later, the details she kept returning to. He didn't raise his voice at all. He said it like a man asking the temperature outside. Was any of last night real? The line went quiet for a long moment. Then Viviana said, with a kind of naked directness that he'd never heard from her before, the tone of someone who has decided the performance is over. You chose to stay. What? I gave you a reason to stay and you stayed. That's what happened. That's the truth. You could have left. You didn't. A beat. You already knew, Dante. On some level you knew and you stayed anyway. So don't call me like this, like I'm the one who... He ended the call. He put the phone on the table and looked at it. His mother said nothing. She sat with her hands around her cup and waited, because she'd been waiting for this particular silence for months, and she understood that rushing it would ruin it. After a while, Dante said, she staged it. His mother didn't confirm or deny. She knew about Lucia. She called me knowing, and she staged the whole thing. His voice was level in the way that voices get level when something is being held down by force. She made sure I stayed. Yes, his mother said quietly. And He stopped. Yes, his mother said again. The kettle had long since boiled. Neither of them touched the cups. Fenwick called back at 11:14. The Financial Crimes Inquiry, he said without hello, is focused on Moretti Holdings accounts between 4 and 7 years ago, specifically the period around the Caldwell acquisition. Dante went very still. The Caldwell acquisition was the deal that had made everything. The deal that had taken a mid-size operation and turned it into what it was now. He had leveraged everything he had for it, and it still hadn't been enough. And then, somehow, it had been enough. And he had always attributed that to timing, to a particular sequence of agreements that had come together in the right order. And he had never looked too closely at the mechanism, because the result had been right, and looking too closely at things that were working was not a habit he'd cultivated. What are they looking for, he said. They're looking at where the bridge capital came from, Fenwick said. The $42 million that closed the gap on the Caldwell deal. It moved through 3 entities and they've been tracing it backward. And? Fenwick paused. Dante, the capital originated in a Viscari subsidiary. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Lucia, Fenwick said quietly. The money came from Lucia. He drove for 40 minutes after that without knowing where he was going. Marco followed at a distance without asking. At some point, Dante realized he was on the highway heading east, which was the direction of nothing in particular, and he took an exit and sat in a parking lot behind a pharmacy and looked at the steering wheel. $42 million. He had built his empire on $42 million of Lucha's money, and she had never said a word. She had watched him stand in boardrooms and take credit for the Caldwell acquisition, and she had never said a word. She had watched him become the man his organization believed him to be, and she had absorbed the cost of that, and she had never, not once, asked for anything back. He thought about the first years of their marriage, when he had been so certain that she needed him, when he had organized his own understanding of their relationship around that certainty. She had given up her social life, her connections, her proximity to her father. She'd told him once that Aldo had opposed the marriage, that there had been a real estrangement over it, real silence between them for years. He had taken this as evidence of her devotion. Understood now, in the parking lot behind the pharmacy, that it might also have been evidence of how much she had sacrificed for someone who had never once tried to calculate the cost. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. An unknown number, different from the detective's. He answered it on the off chance it was anything to do with Lucia or the baby. It was a woman's voice, calm, professional. Mr. Moretti, my name is Renata Souza. I'm calling on behalf of Gerald Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore has asked me to confirm that your wife and daughter are both currently receiving appropriate medical care. Daughter. The word landed somewhere precise. The baby was... Your daughter is still in utero, Mr. Moretti. She has not yet been delivered. I'm simply confirming that both are stable at this time. He exhaled slowly, without meaning to. Mr. Whitmore also asked me to inform you, Renata Souza continued in the same unaffected tone, that any attempt to obtain Mrs. Viscari's location through unofficial channels will be treated as harassment under the relevant statutes and documented accordingly. Mrs. Viscari, not Mrs. Moretti. The name change was already in place. Is she... He stopped. What was he going to ask? Is she okay? Is she angry? Does she hate me? Is there a message she wants me to have? A brief pause. Mr. Whitmore said you might ask that. Another pause. Mrs. Viscari has no message at this time. The line went dead. He sat with the phone in his hand. Outside the pharmacy, a woman was loading grocery bags into a minivan with the focused efficiency of someone who had 6 other things to do today. A man walked past with a dog on a short leash. The ordinary world continuing. His daughter. Somewhere in a hospital he didn't know the name of, fighting to stay in a body that was fighting to keep her, attended by people he hadn't chosen, in a room he didn't have access to. He had done this. He had made exactly one choice, at exactly the moment when it mattered most, and it had produced exactly these results. And there was no version of the next few hours in which that was not the truth. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Dante Moretti sat in a car and felt the specific, unfamiliar weight of having no move to make. Marco, up front, said nothing. He had worked for Dante for 11 years. He knew the difference between the silences that wanted company and the ones that didn't. This was the second kind. Outside, the November sky was doing what it had been doing all morning, staying gray, staying low, committed to its own particular mood with a thoroughness that felt, in the moment, almost personal. Dante put the car in drive. I didn't know where he was going, but staying in the parking lot was finished, and the hospital was closed to him, and the hotel was a place he was not going back to, and the house had Lucia's cup in the drying rack and he couldn't look at it anymore. He drove, and somewhere across the city, in a room she had chosen, in a facility whose name was not on any directory he had access to, Lucia Viscari lay in a bed with 2 IV lines in her arm and her phone face up on the tray beside her, and she did not wait for it to ring. She already knew it wouldn't be him. She had known that since the 3rd call went dead. What she was waiting for now was something else entirely. The slow, grinding work of what came after a decision, the part that nobody tells you about, where you have to keep choosing the same thing over and over in the dark, without drama, without anyone watching, just the choosing and the breathing and the waiting to see if your body will hold. Her daughter's heartbeat moved across the fetal monitor in its small, insistent line. Lucia watched it and said nothing and held on. The audit team arrived on a Wednesday. Dante didn't send them. That was the first thing he had to understand when Fenwick called at 7:40 in the morning with a voice that had lost its usual measured quality. The careful attorney's cadence stripped down to something rawer underneath. The audit team had been authorized by Aldo Viscari's office. Not requested, authorized. Which meant the paperwork had already been filed. The access had already been granted through corporate channels that Dante had no mechanism to block. And the four people who walked into Moretti Holdings' main office building on a Wednesday morning with laptops and document request forms were not there because anyone had asked them to come. They were there because someone had decided they should be. How is this possible? Dante said. He was standing in Fenwick's office, which was on the 14th floor of a building downtown with a view of the river that Fenwick had never once looked at in the 9 years he'd worked there. We have privacy agreements. The Caldwell acquisition created a co-investment structure, Fenwick said. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him covered in handwriting, and he was looking at it rather than at Dante. The terms of that structure gave Viscari's holding company certain oversight rights that were never exercised. He paused. Until now. Those rights were dormant. They were dormant because nobody chose to activate them. Fenwick set down his pen. Aldo Viscari has chosen to activate them. Dante stood very still. Aldo Viscari has not spoken to Lucia in 4 years. Apparently that's changed. The room was quiet. Through the window, the river was gray and moving, the way rivers move in November. Not urgently, just continuously, the way things move when they have no reason to stop. What are they looking for? Dante said. Fenwick picked up his pen again. A habit Dante had noticed over the years. Fenwick held a pen when he was organizing his thoughts, the way other people held coffee. At this point, everything. Full forensic review of all accounts touched by the Caldwell capital. Transaction histories, approval chains, signatory records. He paused. They're particularly interested in 2 accounts that were opened inside the organization in the same quarter the Caldwell deal closed. What accounts? Fenwick looked up from the pad for the first time. Accounts that have your mother's name on them. He called his mother from the car. Not from Fenwick's office, not from the sidewalk. From the car, with Marco up front and the divider window closed, because this was a conversation he did not want to have in a place where sound traveled. She answered on the second ring with the composure she always had, the unshakable morning person steadiness that he had grown up believing was simply her nature and was only now beginning to understand might be something else. They're looking at your accounts, he said. The accounts from the Caldwell period. A pause. Brief. The kind that a person who has been waiting for a call takes when it finally comes. Not surprised, just arrived. I see, she said. Tell me there's nothing in those accounts that connects to the Caldwell capital. She didn't answer immediately. Mother. Dante. Her voice was the same as it always was. That was what undid him. Not a different voice. Not a defensive voice. Not the voice of someone caught. The same voice. There are things about that period that I managed. For the organization. For you. What does that mean? It means the bridge capital required intermediaries. You know that. You knew that then. I knew we had investors. I didn't know... He stopped. His hand on the phone was tight. He could feel the tightness without deciding to feel it. I didn't know it came from Lucia. You weren't supposed to know where it came from. That was the arrangement. What arrangement? Whose arrangement? His mother breathed in slowly. The sound of it came through the phone clearly, the careful, measured breath of a woman deciding how much truth fits in a moment. Lucia came to me, she said, before the Caldwell deal fell apart. She came to me and told me that she had access to capital that could close the gap, and she asked me to manage the transfer so that it moved through appropriate structures and appeared to come from third-party investors. She came to you? Yes. And you agreed? I agreed because the organization needed it, and you were out of options and too proud to ask for help from your wife's family. Her voice took on a small, precise edge. She loved you, Dante. She didn't want you to feel like you owed her. She wanted you to have what you needed without the weight of the debt. That was her choice. That was... He stopped again. The words came apart before he could finish them. You kept this from me for 6 years. We both kept it from you. Don't say we. The tightness in his hand had moved up his arm. Don't put her in the same sentence as you on this. She did something for me. What did you do? Another pause, longer this time. The accounts they're looking at, he said. His voice had dropped to something close to flat. The ones with your name on them. What's in them? Management fees, she said. Standard intermediary compensation. How much? A silence that was one specific kind of silence. The kind that contains a number the speaker is hoping you won't ask them to say. How much? He said again. Over 6 years, across the relevant structures. His mother paused. Approximately 9 million. He sat with the phone in his lap after the call ended. Marco, up front, remained perfectly still. Dante had a particular silence that meant do not speak, and Marco had learned it in the first month of working for him and had never forgotten it. $9 million. His mother had taken $9 million from the capital that Lucia had provided. Lucia's money, Lucia's sacrifice, the thing Lucia had done quietly and without credit, so that Dante could stand in boardrooms and feel like the man who built something. And she had routed it through management fee structures into accounts with her own name on them. And Lucia had known, she had to have known. She had access to every layer of that structure because the capital originated with her. She had watched Claudia Moretti extract $9 million from her gift to her husband, and she had never said a word. He thought about that. He sat in the car and turned it over in his mind the way you turn over something heavy when you're not sure if you want to see the other side. Lucia had known about the fees. She had watched his mother take from the structure she'd built, and she had not said anything to Dante about it, and the only reason she would not say anything was if she had decided that saying something would cause more damage than absorbing it. She had decided that the cost of telling him was higher than the cost of paying it herself. She had protected Claudia from him. She had protected his image of his mother from him. She had carried that particular weight on top of everything else for 6 years, and she had never put it down on a table between them. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment. The pressure was useful. It organized the inside of his skull into something he could navigate. Then he said, "Take me to the office." The audit team had set up in the third-floor conference room. Dante walked past the glass wall on the way to his own office and looked in without stopping. 4 people around the table, 2 men and 2 women, middle-aged, the kind of professionals who wear their competence like a coat they've had for years. Laptops open, document boxes stacked along the wall. The particular organized quiet of people who know what they're looking for and are going to find it. One of them looked up as he passed. She didn't acknowledge him. She looked back at her screen. In his office, he found his head of internal operations, a man named Briscoe, waiting. Briscoe had been with the organization for 8 years, which was long enough to know which situations required waiting in the boss's office rather than calling. "Tell me what they've requested," Dante said, hanging up his coat. "Full transaction records 2018 through 2021. All signatory authorizations above 50,000. All third-party investment documentation for the Caldwell period." Briscoe held a tablet with the request list on it and didn't look up from it. They also requested personnel files for anyone with financial authorization access during that period. "That's a broad ask." "Yes." "What's our obligation under the co-investment agreement?" Briscoe hesitated. 1 second, maybe 2. "Fenwick says full cooperation. The oversight rights in the agreement are fairly comprehensive." Dante looked at him. "Fenwick says." "Yes." "And what do you say?" Briscoe put the tablet down on the edge of the desk. He was a careful man, Briscoe, the kind of person who chose sides slowly and held them. He looked at Dante with the particular expression of someone who has already made a calculation and is deciding whether to share the result. "I think," Briscoe said, "that whatever they're looking for, they already know where to find it. The request list is too specific. They're not fishing. They know exactly which accounts, and they're documenting the trail." Dante nodded slowly. "That's what I think, too." "Sir." Briscoe picked up the tablet again. "There's something else. The request also covers communications records, emails, internal memos, for the period around the Caldwell close," he paused, "and for the 18 months prior to last night." Prior to last night. The phrasing landed precisely. "They're looking at Viviana," Dante said. "They're looking at communications between Ms. Rossi and several internal accounts that had authorization access. He found Viviana in her apartment at 2 in the afternoon. He hadn't called ahead. He didn't want to give her time to arrange herself. She answered the door in a silk blouse and bare feet, and for one moment, just one, the length of a breath, her face did the thing it always did when she saw him, the involuntary brightness. And then she saw his expression, and the brightness went somewhere else, and what replaced it was something more careful. "Dante," she said. Invite me in," he said. She stepped back. He walked past her into the apartment. It was a good apartment, one he'd paid for, he now recalculated, though he hadn't thought of it that way at the time. He'd thought of it as a thing he could do, a comfort he could provide, the way you think of things when you're not keeping track of costs. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." "Viviana," the same flat tone he'd used on the phone. "Sit down." She sat on the arm of the sofa, which was not quite sitting down and was not quite standing up. A posture she'd chosen for its strategic ambiguity, he understood, the way she chose everything. She crossed her ankles and looked at him with an expression of controlled wariness. "The audit team is going through communications records," he said. Internal memos between your accounts and the organization's financial authorization chain. She said nothing. They'll find them within a day, 2 days at the outside. He watched her face. I want to know before they do. I don't know what you're talking about. Viviana. I don't know. Stop. He said it without heat. Without anything, really. And it was the lack of anything that made her stop. I've been running a criminal organization for 12 years. I know what lying looks like when it's performed, and I know what it looks like when someone's actually scared. Right now you're performing. He took one step toward her. I need you to stop performing and tell me what's in those communications. She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were calculating, and he could see her trying several versions of this conversation in rapid succession, looking for the one that worked and not finding it. It was minor, she said finally. Administrative. I had access to certain accounts because who gave you access? She looked away. Viviana, who gave you authorization access? A breath. A small shift in her posture, the armored quality dropping slightly, like a wall losing one brick. Your mother. The room was very quiet. My mother, he said. She wanted someone she trusted to have visibility into certain structures, so that she had a second set of eyes. Viviana looked back at him, and the wariness in her face had shifted into something else, something closer to the surface, less managed. It was her idea. All of it was her idea. What was all of it? The access, the structures she set up, the accounts. Viviana's voice had lost its calibrated quality. What was underneath it was not quite the thing she showed him when she cried, the performed fragility. It was something harder and more frightened. Dante, I was doing what she asked me to do. I was managing what she told me to manage. The fees, the routing, the approvals that went through the secondary accounts. What approvals? There were expenditures, she said, over the last 2 years, from accounts connected to the Caldwell Capital. Your mother had me authorize them, as a secondary signatory. She swallowed. Some of them were... She stopped. Say it. Some of them were not legitimate business expenditures. He looked at her. There were payments, she said more quietly, to a doctor, a psychiatrist, and a private investigator, over a period of about 18 months. For what? The psychiatrist was... She looked at her hands, which were in her lap, and then looked back up. There was a plan, to document Lucia's mental state, to build a record of instability. The investigator was building a file on her behavior, her moods, her responses to stress, things that could be used in a custody proceeding. A custody proceeding, Dante said. If you ever... She stopped again. If I ever what? If you ever decided to leave her, Viviana said. If the marriage ended, your mother wanted to make sure that the outcome regarding the child would be... She searched for a word. Favorable. He crossed the room and stood directly in front of her, and she stood up from the arm of the sofa, not because she'd decided to, but because her body made the decision for her, the instinctive verticality of someone who feels the ground shifting. She was not small, but she felt it now. The particular geometry of standing in front of a man who has just understood something. She was building a case, he said, very slowly. Against my wife, to take her child. Your child, Viviana said. Your mother wanted to make sure the child stayed in the... It is Lucia's child, the first edge in his voice since he'd walked in. It is Lucia's body and Lucia's daughter, and my mother was paying someone to document evidence of mental instability in a woman who was carrying my daughter so that when the time came she could take the baby away from her mother. Viviana didn't answer. How long have you known about this? Dante, how long? Since the beginning, she said, very quietly. Since before Lucia got pregnant. He stepped back. One step, which was the only movement available to him, because the apartment was full of furniture and there was nowhere to go. He stood there with his back against the distance and looked at the woman in front of him and tried to locate, in the catalog of things he knew about himself, whether any part of this was something he should have seen. The answer arrived without drama, without grace. Yes, he should have seen it. There had been 100 small moments over 2 years. The questions Viviana asked about Lucia, seemingly casual, the interest she showed in details that should have meant nothing to her, the way she had always known slightly more about Lucia's state of mind than Dante had told her. He had categorized these as jealousy and moved on. He had not asked what she was doing with the information. He had not asked because it had been convenient not to. Get out, he said. This is my apartment. Get out of this conversation, he said. Go somewhere. Don't call me. She picked up her phone from the coffee table. Her hands were not entirely steady. She looked at him once more with an expression that he might, in a different life, have tried to interpret. He didn't try. He drove to his mother's house at 4 in the afternoon, and she was in the garden despite the cold because she gardened in winter, deadheading things, preparing beds, the kind of maintenance work that other people didn't see and that she found, he had always understood, genuinely satisfying. She looked up when he came through the gate. She did not look surprised. Come inside, she said. We can talk here. She set down her clippers and straightened and looked at him. November light, low and flat, and his mother's face with all its familiar architecture, the face he'd been reading his whole life. And he realized that he had been wrong about what he was reading, all along, that he had been looking at the surface and accepting it as the whole. The psychiatrist, he said. She didn't flinch. Dante, the investigator, the file on Lucia. His voice was doing something strange, keeping itself level with effort, the way a bridge holds weight through tension in its structure, not through the absence of force. You were building a case to take her daughter from her. I was protecting the family's interests. It's Lucia's daughter. She is a Moretti, his mother said, with a precision that was almost clinical. The first grandchild, the first heir. Whatever happens between you and your wife, that child belongs to this family, and I was ensuring that we had the means to establish that legally, by constructing a false psychiatric record, by documenting what was already there. His mother picked up the clippers again, and then put them back down, and he understood that the gesture was something she'd done to buy a second, one small second, to position what she was about to say. Lucia is not a stable person, Dante. She is the daughter of a man who has been fighting her husband for 6 years through a daughter he claims to have estranged himself from. She provided $42 million to your organization without telling you, which is not the behavior of a balanced person. It is the behavior of someone who loved me more than I deserved, he said. His mother looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Not much, but enough. A small recalibration. She knew about the fees, he said. Your fees. The $9 million you took from the structure she built. She knew, and she never told me because she was protecting your relationship with me. He let that sit for a moment. She protected you from me. That's who she is. His mother said nothing. The audit is going to find all of it, he said. The fees, the psychiatrist payments, the investigator, all of it. And when it does, it's not going to look like you were protecting the family. He looked at her across the dead garden, across the November afternoon, across 63 years of a face he thought he knew. It's going to look like embezzlement and conspiracy, and whatever the legal term is for hiring someone to construct false psychiatric evidence to use in a custody case against a woman who saved your son's life. His mother was quiet for a long time. The cold air between them was very still. I did what I thought was necessary, she said finally. I know, he said. That's what makes it worse. He turned and walked back through the gate. Behind him, he heard her say his name once. He didn't turn around. Fenwick called at 7 that evening. Dante was in his office, at his desk, with every light on because the dark felt insufficient for what the day had been. They found the secondary accounts, Fenwick said, the ones your mother controlled, and they flagged the communications between Viviana Rossi and the internal authorization chain. A pause. Dante, there's something else. Tell me. The investigators have found correspondence between Viviana Rossi and a Dr. Marcus Hale. Hale is a psychiatrist who has no record of ever meeting Lucia Viscari as a patient. Fenwick's voice was careful, very careful, the voice of a man delivering news to a client while simultaneously cataloging its implications for himself. The correspondence contains a detailed brief on Lucia's behavior, her stress responses, her emotional reactions, assembled from third-party observation. And it contains a draft assessment, a psychiatric assessment, in Hale's name, on a patient he never saw. Dante closed his eyes. The assessment characterizes Lucia as emotionally volatile, prone to paranoid ideation, and potentially unfit for primary custody of a minor child. Fenwick paused. It was going to be submitted in family court as evidence. Was going to be, Dante said. It was never filed. It was sitting in Hale's files waiting for the moment it was needed. Another pause. The moment being, presumably, when you decided to leave your wife. He opened his eyes. The office was exactly as it had always been. Same desk, same chairs, same view of the city at night, the lights of 800,000 lives going on out there, without any awareness of the particular wreckage that was accumulating in this room. It looked the same, and it was not the same, and it was never going to be the same. And this was the moment that fact became real in a way that could not be argued with. His mother and his mistress had conspired for somewhere between 18 months and 2 years to construct a fraudulent psychiatric record that would have been used to take Lucia's daughter from her. Not his daughter. Lucia's daughter. The daughter Lucia was fighting to keep inside her body right now, in a hospital room that Dante did not have access to, in a building whose name he did not know, attended by people whose names he did not know, while he sat in his office with a phone in his hand and a legal filing in his jacket pocket, and the slow, grinding comprehension of a man who is finally, far too late, counted the cost of the things he chose not to see. "Fenwick," he said. "Yes. Tell me what my exposure is." There was a pause on the line. Not Fenwick's usual pause, something longer, something that had weight in it. "In terms of criminal liability," Fenwick said, "the question is going to be what you knew and when. The embezzlement was conducted through your organization's accounts. The authorization chain includes your name on certain parent documents, even if the specific transactions were handled by your mother and Rossi." He paused again. "The forensic psychiatric fraud is a separate matter. That's potentially criminal conspiracy. And if the prosecution theory is that the purpose of the fraud was to deprive a mother of custody of her child..." He stopped. "Say it," Dante said. "The theory could include you as a beneficiary," Fenwick said, "even if you had no knowledge. The benefit would have accrued to you." The room was quiet for a long time. "Tell me the worst case," Dante said. Fenwick told him. When he was done, Dante sat with the phone in his lap and looked at his hands on the desk in front of him and thought about a woman lying in a hospital bed somewhere in this city, with a daughter who had not yet been born, who had provided $42 million to save the man who left her there, and who had protected the woman who had spent 2 years building a case to destroy her. He thought about the third unanswered call, the sound of Viviana's laugh before the line went dead. He thought about the wedding ring still in his jacket pocket. He'd been carrying it since the hospital. He didn't know why. He reached in and took it out and held it in his palm under the desk light and looked at it for a long time. It was a plain gold band. He'd chosen it himself. He'd told the jeweler he wanted something that would last. He closed his hand around it. Outside, the city went on. The call came at 5:47 in the morning. Dante was still at his desk. He hadn't slept. The office had taken on the particular quality of rooms that have been occupied too long without rest. Stale air, the overhead lights too bright for human eyes at that hour. The city outside gone from night black to the specific gray that precedes dawn without committing to it. His phone lit up with a number he recognized now. "Renata Souza, Whitmore's office," he answered before the second ring. "Mr. Moretti." Her voice was different from the last call. Not the professional neutrality of a legal assistant delivering a message. Something underneath it, controlled, but with effort. "Mrs. Vescari's condition has changed. She's been moved to surgical." He was standing before he knew he was standing. "What happened?" "I'm not authorized to provide medical details. I'm calling because Mrs. Vescari requested it." A pause. "She asked that you be informed." She asked. Not the attorneys, not a protocol, Lucia had asked. "Which hospital?" he said. "Mr. Moretti, I'm not..." "Which hospital?" Not loud. The voice he used when the space for options had closed. "She asked you to call me. That means she wants me to know. Which hospital?" A silence. 3 seconds. 4. "Harrington Institute for Maternal Medicine," Renata Souza said. "East Campus. Surgical floor is 6. The line went dead before he could say anything else. Marco was asleep in the car in the parking garage. Dante woke him with one knock on the window and was in the back seat before Marco had fully processed being awake. He said the address. Marco didn't ask anything. That was what 11 years produced. A man who could read the frequency of a knock on a car window and know that questions were not part of what came next. They moved through the early city in the specific way that cities allow movement at that hour, lights cycling through their colors for empty intersections, the roads belonging briefly to delivery trucks and garbage routes and people with emergencies. Dante sat in the back with his hands on his knees and his eyes on nothing. He did not know what he was going to walk into. He did not know if his daughter was alive. The not knowing was a physical thing. It sat in his sternum like a fist, pushing outward. He had felt fear before. The specific animal fear of real danger, in rooms where outcomes were not guaranteed. But this was different from that. That fear had an object, a direction. You could push back against it. This had no direction. It was just everywhere inside him, pressing at everything. 31 weeks. He knew what 31 weeks meant. He'd read it in the early months, the way you read things when the information is not yet real and you're storing it for later. 31 weeks was early. The lungs were not ready. The systems were not ready. The body knew what it was doing, and it wasn't done yet. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes in the back of the car. The same gesture as yesterday, the same pressure. It still worked. It still organized things. Marco pulled up to the east entrance of Harrington Institute at 6:12 a.m. The woman at the 6th floor nursing station was in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the unhurried manner of someone who has seen every variety of human arrival at every hour and has organized her responses accordingly. "Mrs. Vescari," Dante said. She looked at him over the counter, not unkindly, but with assessment in it. "Name." "Dante Moretti. I'm her husband." She typed something, looked at the screen, typed something else. "Mr. Moretti, you're not listed as an authorized visitor. She asked for me to be called 20 minutes ago. Renata Souza from Whitmore's office called me." He held her gaze. "Check your system." Another moment of typing. She looked at the screen and something in her posture changed. Not much, just a small shift, the adjustment of someone whose information has been updated. "One moment." She picked up a phone and spoke quietly into it. He couldn't hear the words. He stood at the counter with his hands flat on the surface and felt his own pulse in his palms. After 2 minutes, a woman in scrubs appeared from a door at the end of the hall. She was maybe 40, with a face that had the particular quality of people who work in high-stakes medicine. Not expressionless, but economy of expression, every resource going where it was needed. "Mr. Moretti." She didn't extend her hand. "I'm Dr. Nadia Ferris. I've been Mrs. Vescari's attending since her transfer." She looked at him steadily. "Your wife underwent an emergency cesarean section 40 minutes ago." The fist in his sternum pushed harder. "The placental abruption had progressed," Dr. Ferris said. "She'd been stable, but her pressure dropped quickly last night, and we moved to surgery when it became clear we couldn't hold it longer." She paused. "Your daughter was delivered at 5:19 this morning. She weighed 2 pounds, 11 ounces." He heard the weight the way you hear certain numbers. They enter the brain clearly, but the meaning of them takes a moment to assemble. "She's alive," he said. "She's in the NICU," Dr. Ferris said. "She's intubated and she's going to need a great deal of support over the coming weeks. But yes, she's alive and she's fighting." She paused once more. "Your wife is out of surgery. She lost significant blood volume and she's in recovery now. She's conscious." Dante stood very still. "Mrs. Vescari asked to see you," Dr. Ferris said. The way she said it contained no editorial, no warmth or coolness, just the fact delivered cleanly. "I want to be clear that that is her choice and I will support it. I also want to be clear that she has been through major surgery after days of acute physical crisis, and my priority is her recovery. If she asks you to leave, you will leave immediately." She looked at him. "Do you understand?" "Yes," he said. She turned and led him down the hall. The recovery room was smaller than he expected. Lower light than the halls. Deliberate, the particular dimness of a space designed to let a body begin the work of coming back. There was a monitor beside the bed and an IV stand with 2 bags running and a nurse in the corner charting, who looked up when they came in and then looked back down, and Lucia. He had not seen her since the night she was brought into St. Catherine's through the ambulance bay in the white dress. He had not seen her since he'd silenced his phone while she called. She looked smaller than he'd ever seen her look. That was the first thing. Not the pallor, not the IV lines, not the shadow under her eyes that told him about the days she'd spent fighting in a room he hadn't known the name of. The smallness. She had always carried herself like someone who took up the right amount of space, who knew where she was in a room. Now she was lying with her shoulders curved slightly inward, and her hands on the blanket over her abdomen, and she looked like a person who had given a great deal of herself to something, and was currently working out what was left. She turned her head when he walked in and looked at him. He stopped a few feet from the bed. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The monitor beeped its small, steady rhythm. The nurse in the corner existed in the deliberate non-presence of medical professionals who have learned to be furniture when they need to be. "She's alive," Lucia said. Her voice was rough. Anesthesia, he understood, and the hours before it. "They let me see her before they brought me here for a minute." She paused. "She's very small." "I know," he said. "Dr. Ferris told me." "Did she tell you she was fighting?" "Yes." Lucia looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the ceiling. She looked like she was angry about the whole situation, she said, which I think is appropriate. He pulled the chair that was beside the bed out slightly and sat down. Not close. The distance of a man who is not sure what distance is right and is erring toward the side that doesn't assume. Lucia, he said, don't. Her voice was quiet, not sharp, just definite. Whatever you were going to say, don't say it here. Not while I have surgical tape on my abdomen and my daughter is on a ventilator down the hall. She turned her head to look at him again. Her eyes were clear despite everything. That was what he would carry from this room for the rest of his life. How clear her eyes were. I called you because she's yours too. That's the only reason. He nodded. And because she stopped. Breathed carefully, the way people breathe when breathing requires management. Because I spent 3 days in this place deciding what kind of person I wanted to be when this was over. And I decided I don't want to be someone who kept a man from knowing his daughter was born. She looked back at the ceiling. That decision is about me, not about you. He said, I know. The monitor beeped. The audit, she said. I know about it. Whitmore's team is the one running it. I know. I didn't do it to destroy you. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. Then, did you know? About the accounts, about what your mother... No. He said it without hesitation because it was the truth, and because in this room, in front of this woman, anything other than the truth was not something he was capable of. I found out 2 days ago. I've been... He stopped. Started again. Fenwick is cooperating fully with the audit. We've given them everything. Lucia was quiet. I didn't know about the psychiatrist, he said, or the investigator, or the file. His voice did the thing again, the level through force thing, the bridge under tension. I didn't know any of that existed. She turned her head and looked at him. He met her eyes. He held them, because looking away would be the easiest thing in the world, and he was done doing the easy things. I believe you, she said finally. The relief that moved through him was so sudden and so physical that he had to press his feet into the floor to hold it. He didn't show it on his face. She didn't need his relief right now. That doesn't change anything, she said. I know. What they did, what your mother and Viviana did, I want you to understand what that was. They weren't just trying to take money. They were trying to take my child. They were building documentation to stand in front of a judge and say I was unfit. A document written by a man who never met me. Her voice stayed even, controlled with the same effort she'd used for 3 days to keep her daughter inside her. I was in this building for 72 hours before last night, and I spent a lot of that time thinking about what it would have felt like to lose her. Not to lose her the medical way, to lose her the legal way, to have her taken and given to people who... She stopped. Lucia, I'm not telling you so that you feel bad, she said. I'm telling you so that you understand what was being built in your house with your name on the structure. I understand, he said. Do you? Not a challenge. A genuine question, the kind that actually wants an answer. I'm starting to, he said. I was in the hallway outside the NICU 20 minutes later when his phone began going. Not ringing. Multiple messages in rapid succession, the buzz, buzz, buzz that meant something was breaking fast. He looked at the screen. Fenwick. 6 messages. Then a call. He stepped to the far end of the hallway, near a window that looked out over a parking structure, and answered. They've arrested Viviana, Fenwick said. No preamble. Federal agents. This morning. Financial fraud conspiracy. And they've added a charge related to the psychiatric documentation. Fraudulent misrepresentation in a family court context. It's a significant package. My mother. Not yet. They're building the full chain first. But Dante. Fenwick paused, and Dante had known Fenwick long enough to know that a pause from Fenwick of that specific duration meant he was about to say something that required the receiving of it to be done carefully. There's a board meeting this morning, 10 a.m. Your senior directors have been informed of the audit findings, and they've called an extraordinary session. They can't. They can. There's a provision in the operating charter for leadership review in the event of a federal investigation of any principal. It's been there for years. Nobody expected it to be used. Another pause. Briscoe called me an hour ago. He's going to present the findings to the board. The embezzlement, the conspiracy, all of it. Briscoe is going to present. He has the documentation and he has the standing. Dante, he's not doing this against you. He's doing it because the organization needs to demonstrate to federal investigators that it is actively addressing the situation. That's the only way to manage the exposure to the broader business. Fenwick's voice was measured, but there was something underneath it. The sound of a man who has been up all night managing consequences. You need to be in that room. Dante looked through the window at the parking structure. A man was loading something into a van on the second level. The ordinary world, still going. I have a daughter in the NICU, he said. Silence on the line. She was born 45 minutes ago at 2 pounds 11 ounces and she's on a ventilator, he said. And you're telling me I need to be in a boardroom at 10. Dante. Fenwick's voice was the voice of a man who knows the gap between what should be true and what is true, and lives in it professionally. If you're not in that room, the decision gets made without you. And if that happens, you lose everything you've built. The organization, the holdings, I know what I lose. Then be in that room. He stood at the window, counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. Send me the address, he said. The boardroom was on the top floor of a building that Dante had sat in dozens of times, in the chair at the head of the table that had always been his by the particular gravity of accumulated decisions. He walked in at 9:58 with Fenwick beside him and the entire table already full. 11 directors, senior counsel, and Briscoe at the far end with a laptop and a portable projector, and the expression of a man who has been up all night and has organized his exhaustion into something functional. The room went quiet when Dante walked in. He went to his chair, sat down, put his phone on the table face up, the NICU's number already saved in the recent calls. Let's go, he said. Briscoe nodded and pulled up the first slide. It was a transaction chart. The Caldwell capital flow, mapped backward from origin to the current accounts. Color-coded by the audit team with a precision that turned 3 years of financial architecture into something that could be read by anyone in 4 minutes. The capital that funded the Caldwell acquisition originated in a Vescari subsidiary, Briscoe said. He said it without preamble, without softening it. The total amount was $42.3 million. This capital moved through 3 intermediary structures before entering the Moretti Holdings Acquisition Fund. The intermediary structures included accounts controlled by Claudia Moretti, operating principal of Moretti Family Holdings. A man named Castor, who had been a director for 7 years and had the careful eyes of someone who has survived organizational changes by watching more than speaking, said, "When did the organization become aware of this?" 2 days ago, Fenwick said. "And what action has been taken?" "Full cooperation with the audit. All documents requested have been provided." Castor looked at Dante. "And you had no knowledge of the capital's origin?" "No," Dante said. "For 6 years." "For 6 years?" He held the director's gaze. "I was aware we had bridge capital from third-party investors. I was not aware the capital originated with my wife's assets." "Your wife," said another director. "A woman named Harwell, compact and precise, who had joined the board 2 years ago and had always struck Dante as someone running a private calculation in parallel with every meeting, who has filed for divorce and engaged Whitmore's firm to conduct the forensic audit." "Yes. That's a significant conflict of interest on the audit," Harwell said. "The co-investment agreement gives the Vescari holding company legitimate oversight rights." "Rights," Fenwick said. "The audit is legal. The conflict question is a separate matter for the courts." "The courts," Harwell said, "who are also looking at federal charges connected to this organization." She didn't look at Fenwick when she said this. She looked at Dante. "I want to ask something directly, because I think we're all circling it, and it's better said plainly." "Ask it," Dante said. "Did the organization benefit from your wife's assets while she was kept unaware of that benefit?" The room was very quiet. "The organization benefited," Dante said. "Lucia was aware her capital was in play. She structured it deliberately. What she was not aware of," he paused. "What I was not aware of was that certain fee structures around the intermediary accounts were being used to extract capital for private benefit." "Meaning your mother," Harwell said. "Yes." "And your—" She glanced at her notes. "Ms. Rossi." "Yes." Harwell sat back slightly. "And Ms. Rossi had authorization access to internal accounts." "She did." "That you granted." He held very still. "I granted limited administrative access. What she used it for, and the scope of—" "You granted it," Harwell said again. Not loudly, just with a precision that closed the space around the fact. "Yes," Dante said, "I granted it." The room absorbed that. Briscoe pulled up the next slide. This one showed the psychiatric documentation, the payment chain to Dr. Hale, the scope of the investigator's file, the draft assessment. He walked through it in the same factual tone, the tone of a man delivering cargo with no personal attachment to its contents. When he finished, the room was different from what it had been at the beginning of the meeting. The quality of the silence had changed. There were 11 people around that table, and Dante could feel the collective calculation of them, the way a room full of people who have survived in a difficult business calculate things. Not emotionally, not with judgment, but with the cold arithmetic of exposure and outcome. Castor said, "I'm going to move that we appoint an independent operating committee to manage the organization's affairs pending resolution of the federal investigation." Harwell seconded it before he'd finished the sentence. Dante looked at them, then at the rest of the table. He could see it. The math had already been done. The votes were already there. This was a room that had made its decision before he walked into it, and had needed the meeting only for the procedural architecture. "You're removing me," he said. "We're temporarily reassigning operational authority," Castor said, "to protect the organization and its members from further liability. This is not punitive, Dante. It's structural." "How long?" "Until the federal matter is resolved and the audit findings are incorporated." Castor held his gaze. "It could be 6 months. Could be longer." He looked at the table, at the 11 faces, all of which had various relationships to him, spanning various numbers of years, all of which were doing the same thing, watching without quite looking, the careful not looking of people who are doing something they've decided is necessary and don't want to meet the eyes of the person it's being done to. He thought about his daughter on a ventilator 2 miles away. He thought about Lucia in a recovery room with her hands on her abdomen. He thought about the wedding ring in his jacket pocket and the $42 million and a cup rinsed and turned upside down in a drying rack. He said, "All right." Castor nodded. Some of the tension in the room released fractionally. "I want one condition," Dante said. "What condition?" "The cooperation with the audit continues. Full cooperation, everything they ask for, no delays." He looked at Castor, then at Harwell. "I want that in the resolution." "That was already I want it explicit, in the resolution, by name." He looked at them. "I want it on record that Dante Moretti requested full cooperation." Harwell wrote something. "Done." He stood up, picked up his phone from the table. The NICU number was still in the recent calls. "Then I'm going back to the hospital," he said. Nobody said anything as he walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and turned back, once. Not because he had something to say, but because the room had held things for 12 years. Decisions, deals, the architecture of a life he'd built on a foundation he hadn't looked at clearly. And he wanted to see it once more with everything visible. Then he turned and walked out. I was in the elevator when his phone rang again. An unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He answered. "Mr. Moretti," a man's voice. "This is Special Agent Torres. We've been attempting to reach you. We need to speak with you about your role in the financial structures identified in the Moretti Holdings audit." A pause. "We'd like to do this voluntarily and cooperatively, but we need it to happen today." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened onto the marble floor of the building he'd worked in for 12 years. "My attorney's name is Fenwick Crowell," Dante said. "He'll arrange a time." He paused. "This afternoon, whatever time works." He walked out of the building into the November air. The cold hit him flat in the face, clean and immediate. He stood on the sidewalk and breathed it in, once, the way you breathe when you need the outside to come inside you for a moment. He had no empire today. He had a daughter on a ventilator. He had a wife in recovery who had believed him when he said he didn't know, and who had immediately followed that with the information that it changed nothing. He had a federal agent who wanted to talk to him this afternoon. He had a mother who had taken $9 million from the woman who had saved her son, and a mistress who had staged a suicide threat to keep him from his bleeding wife. And both of those women were somewhere in the legal machinery now, and there was nothing he could do about where they landed. He had done all of this. Not the specific crimes. Those belonged to other people. But the conditions, the atmosphere, the particular environment in which those crimes had been not only possible but easy, that was his. He had built it. He had maintained it. He had looked away from what it required him to look away from because looking directly at it would have cost him something, and he had not been willing to pay. He had not been willing to pay for anything. That was the truth at the bottom of all of it, the truest thing. He called the NICU on the way back to the car. A nurse answered, and he said his name, and she said, in the voice of someone giving information they have been cleared to give, "Your daughter is stable, Mr. Moretti. No changes in the last hour. She's holding." He got in the car. "Harrington," he said. Marco put the car in drive. Outside, the city was fully awake now. The daylight version of itself, full volume, all 800,000 lives at once. Dante sat in the back and looked at it and thought about a daughter who weighed 2 pounds, 11 ounces and was holding, and a woman in a recovery room who had told him the truth about herself in 3 sentences while she was still coming out of anesthesia. She had said, "I decided what kind of person I wanted to be when this was over." He turned that sentence over in his mind, examined it from different angles. Not what she would do, not what she would have. What kind of person she would be. He had never once, in 41 years, organized a decision around that question. He thought about what it might mean to start. The car moved through the city. The NICU number was still on his screen. His daughter was holding. Lucia was in recovery. The federal agent was waiting for this afternoon. The board had made its decision, and the audit was running, and all of the things he had built were in the process of being examined in daylight for the first time, and he could not stop any of it, and he was not going to try. He was going back to the hospital. That was the only move he had left, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, the smallness of it, one move, one direction, one door he was allowed to walk through, felt less like a loss than like something he did not yet have a word for. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as clarity, but was rawer than that, less settled. The thing that comes just before you understand what you're actually looking at when you finally stop looking away. The federal interview lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Dante sat across from Special Agent Torres and a second agent named Calloway in a conference room at Fenwick's office. Neutral ground, Fenwick had insisted, and Torres had agreed, which told Dante something about how the government wanted this to go. They didn't want to fight. They wanted information, and they had calculated that Dante Moretti was more useful cooperative than cornered. Torres was younger than his voice had suggested on the phone. Late 30s, with the specific tiredness of someone who had been working this case for longer than one conversation. He had a notepad and a recorder, and he used both, and he asked his questions in the methodical way of someone who already knows most of the answers and is documenting the gaps. Dante answered everything, all of it. The Caldwell Capital, the intermediary structures, the accounts he'd signed parent documents on without understanding what the child transactions were. He answered questions about Viviana Rossi's access and how it had been granted and what he'd believed it was for. He answered questions about Claudia Moretti's role in the organization's financial management over the previous 6 years. At one point, Torres set down his pen and looked at him directly and said, "You understand that full cooperation now does not guarantee immunity on the parent document signatures." "I understand that," Dante said. "You may still face charges." "I understand that too." Torres picked his pen back up. Calloway, who had said almost nothing for 4 hours, made a note. At the end, Torres gathered his materials and said, "We'll be in touch through your attorney." He paused at the door. "Mr. Moretti, for what it's worth, the way this has been handled since the audit began, the cooperation, the full document access, the board resolution, it matters. I can't tell you how much. But it matters." Dante nodded once. Torres left. Calloway left. Fenwick closed the door and sat down across from Dante and exhaled in the way that men exhale when something they've been bracing against has finally happened and turned out to be survivable. "That went as well as it could," Fenwick said. "I know. We're not out of it. The parent document signatures are real exposure." "I know, Fenwick." Fenwick was quiet for a moment. "Then, how's the baby?" Dante looked at the table. "Holding. They say she's holding." "And Lucia?" "Out of the ICU this morning. They moved her to a private room." He paused. "She hasn't asked me to leave." Fenwick absorbed this without comment, which was the right response, and which Dante appreciated. He put on his coat, picked up his phone. The NICU was in his recent calls, 3 entries down, and he looked at it for a moment before putting the phone in his pocket. "I need you to do something," he said. "Name it." "The foundation. The one connected to the Vescari holdings, the one Lucia's father controls," he paused. "I want to make a contribution to it. From my personal accounts. Not the organization's, mine. Before anything else gets frozen or litigated." He looked at Fenwick. "Whatever is liquid right now, all of it." Fenwick was quiet for a beat. "All of it is a significant amount. I'm aware of that." "Dante, she put $42 million into my hands without asking for anything back," he said. "I have no idea what that number looks like in interest and compounded growth over 6 years. I'm not calculating it. I'm not trying to settle a debt. He stopped. "I don't want to be a man who holds on to things that should go somewhere else. Not anymore." He held Fenwick's gaze. "Can you do it?" I can do it, Fenwick said. Today. Today. He walked out into the afternoon. The city was doing its midday thing, full and loud and entirely self-absorbed. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the cold air, and then he called Marco and said the one word that had been his most reliable destination for the last 4 days. Harrington. Lucia's private room was on the 5th floor, east wing, with a window that faced a courtyard where nothing was growing in November, but where the structure of what would grow in spring was still visible, the bones of it, the planting lines, the trellises waiting. She was sitting up slightly when he came in, which was new from the morning, more vertical. The color in her face still not what it would be, but less of the translucence that had frightened him. She looked at him when he walked in and didn't say anything, which was permission to sit down, and he sat. She gained 3 grams, Lucia said. They told me an hour ago. 3 grams. He felt the 3 grams somewhere specific. That's good. They said every gram at this stage is... She stopped and looked at the window. They said every gram matters. I know. She was quiet. He was quiet. The room had the particular silence of a space that has held difficult things and is currently holding something that is not quite anything yet. Not forgiveness, not resolution, not the clear, clean feeling of something completed. Just the 2 of them and the 3 grams and the bones of the courtyard garden visible through the window. The federal interview was today, he said. I know. Whitmore's office tracks these things. She looked back at him. How did it go? I told them everything. She held his gaze, searching it in the way she had always searched his face, not for what she wanted to find, but for what was actually there. He had always found this unnerving. He had spent years interpreting it as scrutiny, as criticism, as evidence that she found him insufficient. He understood now that it was simply what careful attention looked like on a person who had learned not to trust surfaces. Fenwick thinks the parent signatures might still carry exposure, he said. I know. She paused. I've asked Whitmore's team to submit a statement to the federal investigation, on your behalf. She said it plainly, as a fact, with none of the weight it could have been delivered with. Documenting the capital transfer, the intent behind it, the fact that you were deliberately kept uninformed. She looked at the window again. You didn't build your empire on stolen money. You built it on money I gave you without telling you. That's a different thing legally, and it should be on record. He sat with this for a moment. You don't owe me that, he said. I'm not doing it because I owe you something, she said. I'm doing it because it's accurate, and because accuracy matters. She turned back to him. I'm not interested in destroying you, Dante. I haven't been from the beginning. I'm interested in... She paused, and in the pause he could see her choosing the words with the same precision she brought to everything that mattered. I'm interested in what's true. And the truth is that you didn't know. The truth is also that you left. Both things are true. Neither one cancels the other. He looked at his hands. They were folded in his lap, and he looked at them the way you look at things when you're trying to find something to anchor to. My mother, he said. What about her? Have you spoken to her? Since... No. Lucia's voice didn't change. It stayed the same calm it had been. I have nothing to say to your mother, Dante. Not out of anger. I just... She breathed carefully. There's nothing to say. She did what she did from a particular place in herself, and I understand that place. And I'm not interested in spending energy on it. She's going to face charges. I know. For what she did to you. For what she did, yes. A small pause. Don't ask me to feel sorry for her. I can't produce that right now. I'm not asking. She looked at him steadily. What are you asking? He didn't answer immediately. He sat with the question and gave it the space it needed because she deserved an answer that had been actually thought about rather than reached for. I don't know, he said finally. I don't know what I'm asking. I think I'm just... He stopped. I'm sitting in a chair in your room and my daughter is 3 floors up and she gained 3 grams today, and I'm trying to figure out what a person does next when everything they thought they built turns out to have been built on something they didn't look at. Lucia was quiet. I'm not asking you for anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. I know what the filing means. I know what Whitmore's involvement means. I'm not here trying to... He stopped again. The sentence kept failing him. I'm here because she's mine too, and because you let me be here, and that's the only reason I have any right to be in this building. Lucia looked at him for a long moment. The courtyard was gray and still outside the window. Somewhere down the hall, a cart was being wheeled on linoleum, the small domestic sounds of a working hospital going about its day. You can come to the NICU, she said. Tomorrow. I'm asking them to let me go in a wheelchair by then, and... She paused. I'd like you to see her. With me. Once. He nodded. He didn't trust his voice enough to use it. After that, she said, I think you should talk to the attorneys, both sides, about what an arrangement looks like going forward. She said it gently, which was the most devastating way it could have been said. Gently, without heat, without the satisfaction of cruelty. Just the clarity of a person who has done the internal work of deciding. I'm not keeping her from you. She's going to know her father. That's not a question, but we're not. No, she said. We're not. He said, I know. And he did know. He had known it from the empty bed at St. Catherine's, from the moment he'd held the ring in his hand in the hospital hallway, and understood that the distance between what he'd done and what could be repaired was not a distance that could be crossed by wanting to cross it. You couldn't undo a choice by regretting it. Regret was not a mechanism of repair. I understood this now in his body, not just in his thinking. The physical knowledge of a man who had counted the cost of something and found the number larger than anything he had. Okay, he said. She nodded once, looked at the window. They sat in the room together for a while longer without speaking, which was its own kind of thing. Not comfortable, not easy, but real. The reality of two people who had shared a life and were now sorting through what remained in a hospital room in November, with a daughter 3 floors up who weighed 2 pounds and 11 ounces plus 3 grams and was holding. Claudia Moretti was arrested on a Friday, 11 days after the audit team walked into Moretti Holdings. Dante did not watch it happen. He was at Harrington when Fenwick called to tell him. I was sitting in a chair beside the NICU incubator that held his daughter, in the particular focused quiet of the NICU, where sound was managed like a resource. And his phone vibrated in his pocket, and he looked at the screen and saw Fenwick's name and read the text that came through. He put the phone back in his pocket. He looked at his daughter. She was still tiny. She would be tiny for a long time. But she was not the same as she had been 11 days ago. There was more of her now, in some way that was not only about grams, a quality of presence that had been growing alongside the weight. She had been given a name 4 days earlier, Elena. Lucia had chosen it and told him, and he had said it was right, because it was right, and that was all there was to that. Elena Vescari. Lucia had used her restored name for both of them. He sat beside the incubator with his hands on his knees and looked at his daughter, who was sleeping with the focused intensity of someone doing the most important work of their life, which she was. All of her effort was going into the work of becoming, and she was doing it without awareness of the rooms she'd already reorganized, the lives she'd already altered by the fact of her existence. The man sitting beside her who was in the early stages of a reckoning that would take years and who was starting it here, in this chair, watching her breathe. He had been charged. 10 days ago, 2 counts relating to the parent document signatures, both in the secondary tier of the embezzlement structure. Fenwick said the cooperation and Lucia's statement had reduced the exposure significantly. He might not see prison time. He might. The outcome was in the hands of people and processes that did not care about his history or his intentions, only about what the document said, and he had decided to accept that, not because he had no choice. Fenwick had outlined 3 other approaches, but because accepting it felt like the first honest thing he'd done in a long time, and he was trying to practice honesty the way you practice anything, repeatedly, in situations where it cost him something. He reached out and put one finger against the side of the incubator, not touching Elena. The rules of the NICU were timing and duration of it, just near her, the closest available gesture. She kept sleeping. He kept watching her breathe. Viviana Rossi's trial began in the spring. By then, Dante had moved out of the house with the high ceilings and into an apartment on the west side of the city that was smaller than any space he'd occupied since his 20s. He had done this not because he was required to. The house was legally his through the separation agreement, but because the house had Lucia's cup in the drying rack and the kitchen she'd had renovated twice for the light, and 4 years of her presence in every room, and he could not live in it without living in the gap between what it had been and what he'd made it become. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, one for him, one for Elena, on the nights she stayed, which were the nights Lucia allowed, which were structured in the custody arrangement that had been worked out over 3 months by attorneys who were professional and thorough, and who had managed to produce a document that was fair, which Dante understood was a direct consequence of Lucia's approach to the process rather than his own. Lucia had negotiated for fairness, not victory, not punishment, fairness. This had confused Fenwick, who had been expecting a harder line. It had not confused Dante, who by then understood that the absence of cruelty in Lucia was not softness. It was discipline. She had decided what kind of person she was going to be, and she was being it methodically, in every room, in every document, in every exchange, and the effect of it on the people around her was something between respect and the specific discomfort of being near someone who is doing something you know you couldn't do. He went to the trial for one day, not every day. Fenwick had advised against it, for optics, for his own case, for various reasons that made sense legally. But one day, he sat in the gallery and watched Viviana Rossi enter the courtroom, and he looked at her, really looked at her, with the accumulated clarity of 6 months of understanding what she had done and why, and he felt something that surprised him with its mildness. Not rage, not contempt, something more tired than either, and underneath the tiredness, something close to sadness, not for himself, not for Lucia, but for the fact that Viviana had looked at the architecture of what she'd built and had seen it as clever, had organized her intelligence and her charm and her genuine capacity for understanding people around the project of manipulating a situation that had real human beings in it, real blood and real pain, and had never once, as far as he could tell, asked herself what she was actually doing to the people involved. He had done that too, not in the same way, not with the same deliberateness, but in the way of a man who looks away from what is inconvenient and calls the looking away something other than what it is. He sat in the gallery for 3 hours, and then he left and went to pick up Elena from the NICU. She was at Harrington still, though she had come off the ventilator the previous week and was breathing on her own with a steadiness that the nurses called remarkable, which they said in a tone that suggested they meant it. And he held her for the scheduled 40 minutes, and she slept against his chest with the trust of someone who has no information yet about what trust costs. The verdict came 3 weeks later. Viviana was convicted on all primary counts: financial fraud, conspiracy, and the fraudulent psychiatric documentation charge. The sentence was substantial. Her attorney appealed, which was expected. The appeal went nowhere, which was also expected. Dr. Marcus Hale lost his license. The investigator who had assembled the file on Lucia was separately charged with violations of surveillance statutes. The whole structure, the thing his mother and Viviana had built together, the architecture of a plan to take a child from her mother, came apart in the legal system with the thoroughness that such things deserve when they are fully exposed to daylight. Claudia Moretti pled guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 2 counts of embezzlement, in exchange for a sentence that reflected her age and her cooperation. She was not imprisoned. She was fined substantially and placed under supervision, and she lost her role in every structure she'd been part of. Dante visited her once, in the weeks before the plea, in the house where she'd been gardening in November. They sat at her kitchen table, and he told her what he thought she should do, and she listened, and at the end she said she was sorry, and he believed her, and he told her that sorry was a starting place and not a destination, and she nodded and looked at the table, and they did not hug when he left. But he looked back at her through the kitchen window as he walked to the car, and she was still sitting at the table, and she looked like a person who had lived her whole life one way and was in the early difficult stages of understanding that another way had always been possible. He did not know what to do with his love for her. He had not stopped loving her. He had also not forgiven her in any complete sense. Forgiveness of that magnitude was not something that happened in a season or a year. It was not a switch that the right circumstances could flip. He held both things, the love and the unresolved damage, in the same place inside himself, and he stopped trying to resolve the contradiction, because some contradictions are not contradictions, they're just the shape of a complicated thing. Elena came home in April. Home, in this context, meant Lucia's new apartment, the one she'd moved into with her father's help in February, a place she had chosen herself with the particular care of someone furnishing a life from scratch. It had windows that faced east, which meant morning light, which she'd told Whitmore's assistant was non-negotiable because she had spent enough time in rooms that the light didn't reach. Dante was there for the homecoming, not because he lived there, he didn't, but because Lucia had said he should be, and when she said it in the way she said things that mattered, without elaboration, just the plain fact of what she thought was right. He stood in the doorway of Elena's room while Lucia carried her in, wrapped in the blanket that the NICU nurses had folded with the specific tuck of people who understand that the objects associated with safe places need to retain the memory of those places. Elena was awake. She had been awake more often lately, her eyes open and moving over the world with the unfocused intensity of a new person trying to understand the difference between what matters and what doesn't, which is everybody's first project and most people's last. Lucia put her in the crib that had been set up against the east wall, where the morning light would reach it. She adjusted the blanket. She stood over the crib for a moment with her hands on the rail and looked at her daughter, and Dante watched her face in that moment. Not the profile, the full weight of her expression. And what he saw there was not joy exactly, or relief exactly, or triumph. It was something older and quieter than any of those things. It was the face of a woman who fought for something for a long time in a dark room with no guarantees and has finally been allowed to see daylight, and who is absorbing it slowly, carefully, in case it turns out to be temporary. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that would improve the moment, and he was learning, slowly, clumsily, with frequent failures, the difference between moments that wanted words and moments that wanted presence. This one wanted presence. He stood in the doorway. Elena made a small sound, not distress, just the sound of a person recalibrating to new surroundings. Lucia reached into the crib and put one hand on her daughter's chest. The small sound stopped. After a while, Dante said, "I should go." Lucia looked up. She looked at him for a moment and then she nodded. Once, the nod of someone who agrees with something and has nothing to add to the agreement. He turned to leave, then stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me be here." She looked at him with the clear-eyed attention she had always brought to things. The same look she'd had in the recovery room in the hospital 6 months ago when she'd said, "I believe you. That doesn't change anything." "She's yours too," Lucia said. "I already told you that." "I know, He stopped, tried again. "I know I didn't earn the right to be in that room today. I know that. And I'm not going to—" Another stop. The sentence kept trying to become something larger than the moment could hold, and he was trying to keep it honest and small. "I just wanted to say thank you, that's all." Lucia was quiet for a moment. Elena made another sound and then settled. The morning light, even in April, even this early, was doing what it did in east-facing rooms, arriving gradually, softening the edges of things. "You're going to spend a long time feeling like you don't deserve things," Lucia said. Not cruelly, not with satisfaction. The way she said things that were true. "That might be useful for a while, but it's not a permanent state worth living in. She looked at Elena, then back at him. Being a good father to her is not about earning it retroactively. It's about showing up going forward. She paused. That's the work. Just that. He nodded. He left. In the elevator going down, he stood with his hands in his coat pockets and thought about what she'd said. The specific shape of it, the way she had offered it. Not as absolution, not as an opening, just as information. Here's a truth. You can use it or not. He was going to use it. 6 months later, he sat across from Lucia at a table outside a restaurant that was equidistant between their two apartments, which was the geography of their arrangement. Equidistant, measured, functional. They had developed something over those months that didn't have a name for it in the usual vocabulary. Not friendship, not partnership. The specific working relationship of two people who are doing a hard thing together and have decided to do it without adding unnecessary suffering to the difficulty. Elena was with them, in the carrier on Lucia's chest, 7 months old and deeply opinionated about everything, which had become a quality both of her parents described to other people with a mixture of exhaustion and helpless pride. They were meeting to go over the arrangement for the following month, Dante's custody days, a schedule adjustment for a business trip. Lucia was taking to meet with the attorneys handling the foundation's expansion, a question about Elena's follow-up appointments at Harrington. The administrative work of co-parenting, which was unglamorous and necessary and ongoing. Lucia had a legal pad. She had always had a legal pad. He had a phone. They worked through the items. Elena grabbed a fistful of the carrier strap and put it in her mouth and ignored both of them. When they were done, there was the brief pause that came at the end of these meetings. The moment before one of them said they had to go, which signaled the transition back to their separate lives. The foundation, he said. She looked up. The expansion to the new city. I saw the announcement. He paused. It's good. What you're doing, the emergency protocol program, the fund for women who don't have what you had. It's good. She looked at him for a moment, not measuring the sincerity, he thought. She'd done that already, and whatever she'd concluded had determined the shape of the last 7 months. Just taking in the fact of him saying it. It's the work, she said, simply. I know, He stopped before the sentence got away from him again. I was better at this than he had been, the stopping before the unnecessary. I know. Elena pulled the carrier strap out of her mouth and looked at her father with the serious expression she had been deploying since the first month. The expression that her NICU nurses had called her resting business face, and which had turned out to be a permanent feature rather than a phase. She looked at him, and he looked back at her. And she appeared to reach some internal conclusion and looked away, satisfied. Lucia watched this, and something moved across her face. Not a smile exactly, but in the neighborhood of one. The involuntary response of a person's face to something that breaks through whatever they've assembled against the world. He saw it, and he did not comment on it. He filed it in the place where he kept things that were not his to use. He said, "Same time next month?" "Same time," she said. The question Dante was most often asked in the years that followed. By attorneys? By the therapist he'd started seeing 8 months after Elena's birth, by his mother in one of their careful quarterly dinners, by Briscoe once over coffee when enough time had passed that it felt like something that could be asked, was some version of, when did you understand how bad it was? When did you get it? He gave different answers depending on who was asking and what the context was. Some answers were simpler, some were more complete, but the honest answer, the one he gave the therapist, the one he gave himself in the dark, was that he had understood it in 3 stages, and none of them were the stage you'd expect. The first was not the empty hospital bed. The empty bed had been shock. And shock is not understanding. Shock is the moment before understanding, the body's way of creating a space in which something can land. The second was not the audit or the arrest or the boardroom. Those were consequences. They told him the cost of what he'd done, and knowing cost is not the same as knowing wrong. The third, the real one, the one that went all the way down, was the moment in the recovery room at Harrington when Lucia had said, "I decided what kind of person I wanted to be when this was over." Because in that moment he had understood for the first time that he had never once asked himself that question. Not once in 41 years. He had asked what he could get, what he could build, what he could keep. He had never asked what kind of person he was in the process of becoming. And by the time you stop asking that question for long enough, the answer has been decided for you by the accumulation of everything you chose not to look at. He had looked away from Lucia's sacrifice and called it her devotion. He had looked away from his mother's greed and called it family loyalty. He had looked away from Viviana's calculation and called it love. He had looked away from himself most of all and called the looking away strength. That was the understanding, not the cost, the mechanism, the specific way he had built his blindness, brick by brick, over years, until it was so thorough that it looked from the inside like a clear view. He was not done understanding it. He suspected he would not be done for a long time. The last scene he would carry, not the last thing that happened, but the last image that settled into the place where settled things go, came on an October morning, 2 years after the night in the emergency room. He was picking Elena up from Lucia's apartment. She was walking now, or something adjacent to walking. The aggressive, forward-leaning locomotion of a toddler who has decided that upright is the correct state and is committing to it without full command of the mechanics. She met him at the door, which is to say she appeared behind Lucia's legs when the door opened and looked at him with her resting business face. And then something resolved in her expression and she reached both arms up, which was what she did when she wanted to be picked up, and he picked her up. She smelled like the specific warmth of a child who has just had breakfast. He had learned this smell, and it had become one of the most reliable things he knew, in the way that certain sensory things become reliable. They don't change, they're just there, and their there-ness is a form of truth that does not require interpretation. Lucia stood in the doorway with her coffee. She was dressed for work. The foundation had offices now, 2 of them, and she moved between them with the particular energy of someone doing what they were made for. She looked well. She looked, he thought, like a woman who had been stripped down to what was actually there and had found it sufficient, which was maybe the most unlikely and most real kind of good. She hasn't slept well, Lucia said, so she might crash in the car. Okay. And she's been saying something that sounds like cat, and we do not have a cat, so I don't know where that came from. Maybe she saw one outside. Maybe, Lucia looked at Elena, who was inspecting the collar of Dante's jacket with scientific thoroughness. She has an appointment Thursday. Harrington, follow-up. I'll send you the details. I'll be there. Lucia nodded. She looked at him for a moment, over the top of her coffee cup, with the clear-eyed attention. There was no charge in it, no grief, no unsettled anger. Just the look of a woman who has organized herself around what is real and is operating from that place. Okay, she said. Have a good day. You too, he said. She went back inside. The door closed, not loudly. just closed, the ordinary sound of a door doing what doors do. He stood on the landing with his daughter on his hip. Elena had concluded her examination of his jacket collar and was now looking out at the street with the focused alertness she brought to everything, taking in the October morning with both eyes fully open, cataloging. He looked at her, looking at the world. He thought about a wedding ring in a jacket pocket, about a cup rinsed and turned upside down in a drying rack, about a woman who had called him 3 times from an emergency room, and on the third call heard a woman laughing before the line went dead, and who had then, in that same hour, made 3 calls of her own and begun the quiet work of saving herself. I thought about the kind of person he had been, and the kind of person he was still, imperfectly, daily, in the small decisions rather than the large ones trying to become. Elena turned from the street and looked at him. She patted his cheek with one open hand, the gesture she had developed in recent weeks. Not a strike, not a pet, just contact. The assertion of presence. Here, real, mine and yours. He held her. "Okay," he said to her. "Let's go." She looked at him with the business face and then, apparently satisfied with whatever she'd assessed, looked back at the street. He carried her down the stairs and into the October morning, and the morning received them without ceremony, the way mornings do, without judgment, without memory, without any awareness of what had been paid to arrive at this ordinary moment in this ordinary light, on a sidewalk in a city full of lives going on in all directions, each one carrying its invisible cost, each one finding its own way through. He walked. The street was full of the sounds of a Tuesday. Elena held on to his jacket with both fists and looked at everything.